and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, which, if you are listening on the exact day that it was published, is Halloween Eve, we are going to look at a wonderful Welsh landmark that combines some of my favourite things. First of all, it is supposedly haunted. Very haunted. And in recent times, people have reported encountering strange apparitions and strange shadow figures lurking in the darkness. Secondly, this place is absolutely steeped in folklore. There are stories of the fairy folk and of death omens left, right and centre, and I do love it when a location like this combines those older, let's say less believable tales with those more recent accounts which are much more spine-chilling. Which brings me to the third and final reason, and this is why I thought this would be perfect for the Halloween episode, because I have a first-hand account, an excellent first-hand account from somebody who spent the night there and let's just say had a night to remember. And not just on any old night, but on Halloween. Yes, on Halloween. We have a first-hand account from somebody who experienced some kind of paranormal activity at this location on Halloween, which makes it perfect for this episode. But anyway, that's enough build-up, enough preamble. Let's dive straight in. And so, to begin at the beginning. And the subject of this episode, all of these events take place in Pennard Castle. Pennard Castle, which stands on high in a picturesque spot in the Gower Peninsula. And I've spoken about a few of my favourite castles recently, like Margam Castle and Craigenors Castle, but unlike those, Pennard Castle is a real castle. It's not some fancy mansion, it's not some Victorian fairy tale home. This is a bona fide castle, or at least the bona fide remains of a castle. It is the shell of a castle, a shell of its former self, perched up on high, overlooking those golden sands of Gower, which, incidentally, are themselves supposedly haunted by hundreds of spirits. But that's a story for another day. Maybe we'll save the haunted sands of Gower for next Halloween. But for now, back to Pennard Castle, and if you can picture the scene, the skeletal remains of a Norman castle standing up on high, surrounded by this glorious scenery. Below it is the sand, which some say swallowed up a surrounding settlement, and is the reason why this castle was left abandoned sometime around the 14th century. And beyond the sand is the sea itself, the crashing waves that come into shore. And I'm not just being poetic here by setting the scene so thoroughly. The sea and the sand are going to play an important part in this story later, which is why I'm just making it clear now how close all these elements are together. Now, Pennard Castle, according to folklore, is guarded by one of Wales's most terrifying of death omens, and that is the Gwrach y Rhibyn. Now, a death omen, as the name suggests, is an omen of death, while the Gwrach y Rhibyn is a witch-like figure known as the Hag of the Mist in English, which shares similarities with the Irish Banshee because of the way she screeches, and is said to look more like a harpy than a human, although you are probably more likely to hear the Gwrach y Rhibyn rather than see it. And it is said she flies through the night sky on leathery wings, and, like most death omens, she is a warning to those who encounter her or hear her that the end is nigh. And it was said that in Pennard Castle specifically, anyone who spends the night there will be bewitched by the Gwrach. And if she doesn't get you, hypothermia might, because it's a windy, chilly old spot up there. But one young man from Carmarthen did just that. He spent the night there and discovered the hard way what would happen when, so the story goes, a ghost-like figure attacked him and left him for dead. He was found bloody and bruised the next day, and when he came around, he spoke of how a witch had clawed and pecked at him like a frenzied bird of prey. Now, as it turns out, this young man from Carmarthen did consider himself to be quite lucky, and I do like to find the positive on this podcast where I can, because he was still alive. People were supposed to die when they encountered the Gwrach. He didn't. He was still alive. But what he discovered was that from that day forth, he was cursed. He had been bewitched to live out his life as, and I quote, a lunatic. So yes, he was still alive, but he lived the rest of his life as, to quote, a lunatic. And is that a fate worse than death? Yes, you're still alive, but you're slightly out of your mind. Well, I guess you could say he might have been slightly out of his mind to spend the night in chilly old Pennard Castle in the first place. But before we worry about any more folklore, we need to take a quick look at the history of the castle. And the history of Pennard Castle doesn't quite line up with the legend surrounding it, in much the same way as nearby Oystermouth Castle, which I recorded an episode about a year or two ago, and which, by the way, is another amazing place to visit at Halloween time. But much like Oystermouth Castle, Pennard Castle was built in stone for the powerful Breos family at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries. According to legend, however, it just sprang up in a single night at the behest of a particularly impatient Norman lord who employed a sorcerer instead of builders, which is nice if you can do it. If you're having trouble finding a builder, get the sorcerers in. And this Norman lord wasn't just impatient, he was, frankly, a nasty piece of work. Again, a lot of similarities here with the legend surrounding Oystermouth. And it wasn't just the Lord who was a nasty piece of work, but all of the people he associated with were as well, which is usually the case, isn't it? Nasty people and bullies tend to hang around with other nasty people and bullies, and that was the case. And one day, all of these nasty people and bullies were gathered together at Pennard Castle for the wedding of the Lord's daughter. And to say the celebrations were wild is putting it mildly. I wrote about Pennard Castle in my last ghost book, Paranormal, Swansea and Gower, available from all good bookshops offline and on. And one of the challenges I had when I was writing that book is I was a little bit constrained by the word count. My publisher wanted lots of nice pictures in the book, which is great. It makes it look pretty, but I had to be a little bit less descriptive at times. And so I went back to check how I described this scene in the book using as few words as possible. And it's a bit pretentious in hindsight, but I wrote that it descended into a scene of bacchanalian excess. A scene of bacchanalian excess, which in plainer English means the wine was flowing and people were behaving in ways that, let's say, you wouldn't normally behave in polite society until the festivities were interrupted by some strange lights and sounds outside, like fireworks going off. So there they are, enjoying their bacchanalian revelries, and then they are disturbed by all this noise and flashing. So the Lord gathered up a party of his friends, got his mates together to go outside and sort it out, to put an end to this disturbance that, as far as they were concerned, was wrecking the wedding and, more importantly, wrecking their partying. So they rode their horses out into the Gower countryside, and they discovered the source of the illuminations were the very Volk. That's very, V-E-R-R-Y, Volk, V-O-L-K, the Gower fairy folk, which I've spoken about in depth on a previous episode if you would like to go and listen to that afterwards. And the reason they were making such a noise, such a kerfuffle, is that they were also celebrating the princess's big day. It was a day of celebration for everyone in and around Pennard, and that included the fairy folk, and they were showing how happy they were about the marriage. And when they saw the Lord coming towards them, they assumed he was coming to thank them for honouring the occasion, to maybe even invite them to the party, and they could not have been more wrong. The Lord in his drunken stupor, assumed their merriment was a sign of aggression. He didn't think they were celebrating. He thought they were creating a nuisance. He thought they were trying to disturb the wedding. And he ordered his men to attack. Now, the very folk were partying. They were defenseless. They were dancing, not carrying swords. And this gang of men turned up armoured with horses. And what happened next was, frankly, a massacre. What I described in the book using as few words as possible as a bloodbath. Very quickly, the very folk were nearly all killed before the Lord realised his mistake. And one of the few survivors when the fighting stopped was the Queen of the very folk, who stared straight into his eyes and cursed him with a single word: coward. The next day, when the Lord awoke, nursing a hangover, he looked outside and watched with growing apprehension as dark clouds gathered in the sky. And we all know that something ominous is coming when dark clouds gather in the sky. The waves in the sea below. And I did tell you that the sea would be cropping up again later in this story. I wasn't just setting a pretty scene earlier. The waves in the sea below became violent, and a sandstorm whipped against the battlements. And if that wasn't enough, throughout all of this, above it all, they could hear a terrifying screaming noise echoing throughout the castle. They instinctively knew, and you also know because I told you at the start of the episode, but they instinctively knew this was the cry of the Gwrach y Rhibyn, the death omen, the witch or hag of the mist. And as her shriek reached fever pitch, sand flew over the ocean from Ireland and smothered the castle, the surrounding area, and everyone that was underneath. Now, historically, the castle was indeed abandoned due to encroaching sand. That part of it is historically accurate. However, whether or not that sand was sent as a result of a vengeful curse or not is open to debate. I'll let you decide. But as for the Gwrach's wailing cry, that is still heard today on strong westerly gales by foolish mortals like those from Carmarthen who decide to spend the night there. Although the most numerous creatures said to haunt the area today, the ones you really have to look out for, are not the ghosts and goblins, rather, it's the golfers, because Pennard Castle is handily there on this golf course. So never mind the screams of the Gwrach y Rhibyn, it's the flying golf balls you have to look out for if you are going to be traipsing around this area. Now, folktales and golf balls aside, I did mention that in more recent times, people have reported seeing apparitions there and shadowy forms, which seem to be the most numerous of sight. And these shadowy forms, the kind of shadowy forms that do get reported in old buildings like this, where people catch the glimpse of something just peering out from a window or a doorway and then just flitting away. But the number of people who've reported these maybe suggests that it's not just a trick of the light or your imagination playing tricks on you. And one person who I think would certainly say that it's not a trick of the light is Greg Stockdale, the man who very kindly recalled his Halloween adventure there when he and a group of friends in their younger years back in 1998 dared each other for Halloween to walk around the local haunted locations, and he remembers that they visited these spooky landmarks while telling ghost stories at each one. And while they had a good time, they went out telling scary stories. Nothing paranormal happened, and neither did they expect it to either. That wasn't the point. They were out to tell stories. They weren't going out ghost hunting. But after visiting these haunted locations, they timed it perfectly to arrive at Pennard Castle at midnight, the witching hour. And Greg recalls that, to quote, "In true cliché fashion, a thick fog rolled in from the sea as we sat with the castle behind us. The storyteller of the group tapped me on the shoulder and whispered, 'Something is playing games with us,' and nodded in the direction of a section of ruined wall. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see a shadowy form peeking at us. But as I turned my head to look, it seemed to duck out of sight, only to reappear when I looked away. So it seems like this shadowy form is almost playing peekaboo. It's looking, and when you turn to look, it's disappearing again. But that wasn't the only thing, because to continue again, to quote Greg, I also saw a figure of a woman in big skirts, seemingly bending down and picking stuff up off the floor. This was a weird thing, really, because it was just a very eroded shadow in the fog. And just to interrupt quickly, I do think eroded is an interesting word to use there, very evocative word. This isn't a crystal clear shadow, it's an eroded shadow in the fog. But to return to Greg, and he tells us, I got the clearest impression that that's what it was. It only lasted a few seconds before swirling away in the breeze. Now, if that wasn't enough, and that would be enough for most people, multiple shadowy figures appearing and disappearing into the mist. But if that wasn't enough, there was more to come, because the figure appeared to reappear a second time later on, this time walking through the archway of the gatehouse. And when he saw this, Greg tells us that, to quote again, originally, I figured it was a gap in the fog because it moved in the direction of the wind, but then it moved the other way. It did this a few times, giving the impression of a guard patrolling the gate. So to clarify this a little, at first he assumed this wasn't a figure, but it was some kind of break in the mist, like a gap in the mist, and he was seeing the clear sky through it, as it were. But if that was the case, you would expect it to continue drifting with the wind. If the wind is blowing eastwards and the mist is drifting eastwards, you would expect this shape to keep going eastwards with it. But this shape appeared to have some kind of consciousness, because it was moving back and forth. Yes, it was going east, but then it was going west against the mist, almost as if the word he uses is patrolling. The shadow was going back and forth, patrolling the entrance and keeping an eye on what they were up to. They were, it would appear, being watched by some security guard of some sort, a spooky security guard. And after which, he says, the fog got thicker and we decided to call it a night. And who can blame them? But if that wasn't enough, there's still more to come, even after deciding it was time to go home, because the fog itself appeared to be supernatural in some way, as if it was trying to confuse them and prevent them from leaving. And Greg tells us that as he walked through that spot where that figure had been, that figure that was patrolling, he felt a sudden chill. And despite being very familiar with the area, he said, he discovered that thanks to the fog, they were lost. I mean, this is somewhere, these are kids who'd grown up in this area, but they were lost. And as an aftermath to this, and another positive spin, this is turning into a positive episode, well, kind of sorts, besides the death omens and stuff. But Greg does say that despite all of the strange things that happened that night, they did not in any way deter him from going back to Pennard Castle. He's been back many times since and has not experienced anything else paranormal. So how do we explain all the events that happened that night? Well, maybe it's not just the place, but maybe it's the time. Maybe to really see Pennard Castle at the peak of its spookiness, you need to be there at midnight, surrounded by a swirling fog on Halloween. And that, I think, is the perfect way to wrap up this Halloween episode. And if you do find yourself anywhere near the Gower Peninsula this Halloween, be sure to pop along to Pennard Castle, and if you drive through the Mumbles first, be sure to pop to Oystermouth Castle as well. And on that note, having done my little bit for the Gower Tourist Board, or the Swansea Tourist Board, and no, I'm not on commission, that brings us to the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button and leaving a nice review. And if you really, really enjoyed it, you can, as always, treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very much appreciated, and it helps keep this thing on the air. And this time of year, it's also going to be pumpkin spiced. If you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media, and I've also published many books now about similar weird and wonderful subjects, including Paranormal Swansea and Gower, which features Pennard Castle. And as I mentioned on the last episode, I have been working on some documentaries and some video stuff, for want of a better word for now, with my good friends Steve, Ant and Al, called Paranormal Unpacked. That's Paranormal Unpacked, and you can find us on YouTube is probably the best place for video, but we're also sharing it on Instagram and various places. And we have recorded a special Halloween episode, which I believe is going out the same day as this podcast, so it will definitely be available in time for Halloween itself. And for this episode, we spent some time and conducted some experiments in a pub that has been described as one of the most haunted in South Wales. And, well, actually, I'm not going to spoil it all here, so if you would like to see our ghost hunt for Halloween, be sure to search for Paranormal Unpacked. All of which just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch and fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, the next time somebody starts setting fireworks off at a wedding, no matter how annoying they might be, you might want to think twice before attacking them. Until next time, happy Halloween, nos Calan Gaeaf hapus, and nos da.